"Ma'am, this seat is reserved for real VIPs," the flight attendant snapped, her voice slicing through the cabin like ice. Ava Morgan stood frozen, ticket in hand, as cameras flashed and passengers sneered, unaware they were humiliating the very woman who owned the airline. What began as quiet stares had erupted into a public spectacle of judgment, but no one knew the storm that was about to follow. Ava Morgan walked quietly through Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, her steps steady, her presence unassuming. She wore a simple cream-colored linen dress and a pair of well-worn flats. Her dark curls were gently tied into a low ponytail, framing a face both calm and kind, with warm brown eyes that carried more wisdom than most noticed. On her wrist was a delicate gold bracelet passed down from her late mother, a reminder that dignity has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with character. She carried only a modest leather backpack, inside of which were a few personal items, a hardcover book, and a laptop filled with plans for the future of the company she co-founded. That company was Nova Wings Airlines, one of the fastest-growing airlines in the United States, known for its innovation, inclusivity promises, and impeccable service. What the thousands of travelers walking past her didn't realize, couldn't possibly know, was that this gentle woman, blending into the terminal like any ordinary traveler, was the airline's largest shareholder and co-founder. And she wasn't just anyone. She was Ava Morgan, wife of the company's CEO, Jordan Morgan, a brilliant black tech entrepreneur who had turned a modest software startup into a billion-dollar empire. But today, Ava wasn't a business mogul. She wasn't a boardroom strategist or a corporate power figure. Today, she was simply a tired woman hoping for a quiet flight from Phoenix to Portland to attend a weekend charity event. Ava approached the first-class check-in counter. A young blonde woman in a tailored Navy uniform smiled brightly until her eyes met Ava's outfit, simple, unfashionable by luxury standards, even plain. The smile faltered. The receptionist's fingers paused over the keyboard for a second too long. "Name, please?" she asked, her voice slipping into something colder than courtesy. "Ava Morgan," Ava replied, politely handing over her phone with the digital ticket already pulled up. The woman squinted at the screen. "You're in first class?" she asked, more surprised than inquisitive. Ava offered a warm smile. "Yes. Seat 1A. The woman tapped a few more times and then reluctantly printed the boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," she said, though her tone suggested anything but. At the gate, the murmurs began. Ava stood in the priority boarding line, surrounded by sharply dressed passengers, their designer luggage and $1,000 shoes a stark contrast to her modest style. A tall man in a gray suit scoffed loud enough for others to hear, "They're letting anyone into first class these days." A woman behind him whispered to her husband, her voice tinged with contempt, "She probably won some contest. Maybe one of those charity giveaways." Ava kept her eyes forward, her expression still gentle, her hands calmly resting at her sides. As she stepped into the luxurious first-class cabin of Nova Wings Flight 208, the judgment followed her like a shadow. The leather seats, soft overhead lighting, and aroma of fresh citrus were meant to evoke comfort. But the moment Ava appeared, the temperature in the room shifted. Passengers froze mid-conversation. Eyes tracked her like motion sensors. A white woman seated in 2A let out an audible sigh and turned to her friend. "God, I hope she's not sitting next to me," she muttered. But Ava walked right past her. She reached seat 1A, placed her bag neatly in the overhead bin, and sat down with the grace of someone used to being overlooked, yet never diminished by it. Minutes later, the lead flight attendant appeared. Diana Shaw, a 52-year-old woman with a tight blonde bun and a tighter jaw, wore a polished navy suit with a golden wing pin on her lapel. She moved like she owned the cabin. Her gaze swept over Ava with a stiffness that betrayed her disapproval. Following closely behind her were two junior attendants, Megan Fry, a redhead in her early 30s with a permanent smirk, and Cole Jensen, a muscular, clean-shaven man with a cold stare. Diana stopped at Ava's seat and cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. This seat is reserved for a premium guest." Ava met her eyes calmly. "There's no mistake. I'm Ava Morgan. This is my seat." She handed over the printed boarding pass. Diana took it, glanced at it briefly, then passed it to Megan, who gave Cole a look of disbelief. Cole crossed his arms. "You're going to need to come with us. We'll get this straightened out in economy." Passengers nearby began to whisper again. A man in a navy blazer leaned into the aisle, watching with interest. Megan added with a sickly sweet voice, "You know, these things happen. Maybe you meant to book, Coach." Ava didn't respond to the bait. She simply said, "I purchased this ticket. I helped design the booking system. Please check again." But Diana didn't budge. "Either you move voluntarily, or we'll have security escort you," she snapped. Megan smiled smugly. "It's better if you don't make a scene." Cole stepped closer, a clear intimidation tactic. At that moment, Ava felt the tight squeeze in her chest, not fear, but the familiar, bitter sting of injustice. Of being treated as invisible in a space she had helped create. She rose slowly, gracefully, took her bag, and walked down the aisle in silence. Every step she took toward the back of the plane felt like a blow to the chest, not because of where she was going, but because of why she was being sent there. When she reached economy, they didn't even offer an apology. Instead, Megan pointed to the cramped seat 32D with a flat voice, "This one's yours." Ava sat. Around her, passengers who had seen the confrontation began whispering. Some chuckled. Others pulled out their phones. A young man 2 rows back muttered, "She had to be faking it." "First class?" "Not with that look." A woman with bright red lipstick laughed to her companion, "Bet she forged the ticket. Probably thought no one would notice." A man 1 row over leaned into the aisle and said loudly, "That's what happens when people try to play rich. You get caught." Ava opened her book, though she couldn't read a word. The words on the page blurred beneath her eyes, and the pages trembled slightly in her hands. Each cruel comment pierced her like glass. Her dignity was shredded in front of a plane full of strangers, and all she could do was breathe through it. The hardest part wasn't the judgment, it was the silence from the crew. The absence of decency. The betrayal from an airline that had once been built on compassion and fairness. Her airline. In the row across the aisle, Greg and Serena Mathis, a well-known couple in Scottsdale social circles, were recording her. "Look at this," Greg laughed, angling his phone. "She thought she could sneak into first class. Unreal." Serena posted the video to her social media within seconds, writing, "Caught a fraud today. First class faker gets busted and kicked to coach. LOL." The post immediately began gaining likes and shares. Ava saw the screen briefly as Serena tilted it to show Greg. Her face was right there, her humiliation frozen in digital form. Forever. But Ava didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She simply looked down at her bracelet, gently rubbed her thumb over its worn edges, and told herself one thing: they have no idea who they just humiliated. But they will. Somewhere deep inside her chest, amidst the searing pain and shame, a fire was beginning to rise. Ava Morgan had stayed silent long enough. The justice she believed in, the dignity she had always fought for, would now have a face. Hers. And it all started with this flight. The shame they tried to force upon her would soon become theirs to carry. The moment the wheels of the plane touched down in Portland, Ava Morgan sat motionless in her narrow seat at the back of the economy cabin, her hands resting on the same worn leather backpack she'd carried with quiet grace hours earlier. Around her, passengers eagerly unbuckled, grabbed their luggage, and flooded the aisle, voices buzzing with post-flight chatter. But Ava remained still. Her thoughts were not on her destination anymore. They were consumed by the searing memory of humiliation, of judgmental stares, cruel laughter, and the bitter sting of being dehumanized on her own airline. Nova Wings. The airline she and Jordan had built from the ground up. The airline that promised dignity to every passenger, no matter their background, wealth, or skin color. Now, that promise had been broken, publicly, and by their own staff. As the crowd thinned and Ava stepped onto the jet bridge, the warmth of the city air did little to ease the cold ache tightening in her chest. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and with steady fingers sent a short message to her husband. "We need to talk. Urgently." She didn't need to say more. Jordan Morgan had always known how to read between her silences. He responded within seconds, "I'll have the boardroom ready. You won't go through this alone." By 8 o'clock the next morning, the sleek glass tower of Nova Wings Seattle headquarters was buzzing with tension. Employees whispered in hushed tones. An urgent, company-wide email had been sent at dawn from the CEO's office. "Emergency all-hands meeting at 10 a.m., attendance mandatory." No one knew what it was about, but the energy in the building felt electric, volatile, as if something massive was about to break open. On the top floor, in the expansive boardroom with floor-to-ceiling views of the city, senior executives, flight operations managers, and department heads began to file in, joined by representatives from HR, legal, and the corporate PR team. Diana Shaw sat near the front, her crisp uniform perfectly pressed, her hair in its usual tight twist. Megan Fry and Cole Jensen flanked her, both unusually quiet. The viral video from the flight had already begun making the rounds online, though none of them had imagined it would reach the executive suite so soon. Diana whispered to Megan, "Just stay calm. This'll blow over." "They don't know who she really was." Megan nodded uncertainly. Cole, his jaw tight, didn't say a word. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doors swung open. Jordan Morgan entered first, dressed in a dark tailored suit, his expression unreadable. His commanding presence instantly silenced the room. Behind him walked Ava, graceful, composed, and wearing the same cream linen dress she had worn on the flight. But today, she wore it like armor. The moment she stepped into the room, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Diana's face went white. Megan's hand shot to her mouth. Cole stiffened. Jordan stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping the room slowly. "Before I speak," he said, his voice low and firm, "I want you to hear something very important, and I want you to remember it." He turned to Ava, gently gesturing for her to take the floor. Ava walked forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The room had already leaned into her presence. 2 days ago, she began, "I boarded Nova Wings Flight 208 from Phoenix to Portland. I was traveling alone. No staff, no assistants. Just me, dressed simply, with a ticket I had purchased like any other passenger." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I was stopped. Judged. Mocked. Harassed. Laughed at. I was stripped of my dignity in front of dozens of strangers, and all of it was recorded, shared, ridiculed online. All because of how I looked. All because I didn't look like I belonged in first class." Silence fell thick over the room. "I am Ava Morgan," she continued, her voice steady, co-founder of Nova Wings Airlines. "I own 41% of this company. I helped build the customer service philosophy that each of you is trained under. I wrote the policy on inclusion that's printed in our handbook. And yet, even that could not protect me from the racism and classism that lives, very clearly, within our walls." Gasps echoed. Some executives turned pale. Others looked down at the table. Jordan took his place beside her and spoke next, his tone sharper than his usual composed manner. "You all know me as your CEO. What you may not have realized, what some of you clearly failed to realize, is that Ava is not just my wife. She is this company's soul. And yesterday, that soul was trampled." He tapped a button on the remote in his hand, and a presentation appeared on the screen behind him. The title read, "Dignity in Every Cabin, a report on discrimination at Nova Wings." The room held its breath. "Over the past year," Ava said, stepping forward again, "we have received, directly and indirectly, 29 credible reports of racial discrimination, most of them involving passengers of color being mistreated by our own employees. Some were brushed off. Others never reached this room. Until now." She began listing them: a black veteran wrongly accused of trying to sneak into business class, a Latina mother told her infant's crying was unfit for premium, a Southeast Asian couple seated near the lavatory despite having booked front row seats. The pattern was undeniable. Jordan turned to the crowd. This company was built on respect. But what happened to Ava and to those 29 passengers is not respect. It's betrayal. He looked directly at Diana Shaw. You demoted my wife without cause, in public, using prejudice as your justification. You violated not only our company policy, but basic human decency. Diana tried to speak, her voice shaking. Mr. Morgan, I had no idea she was but Jordan cut her off. That's exactly the point. You shouldn't need to know someone's title or name to treat them with dignity. The silence was deafening. Megan looked on the verge of tears. Cole's face was stone, his fists clenched in his lap. Effective immediately, Jordan said, Diana Shaw is reassigned to our customer complaints division. Megan Farr will be serving in economy class service indefinitely. Cole Jensen will be relocated to ground operations at the Portland baggage unit. Whispers surged across the room. Furthermore, Ava added, Greg and Serena Mathis, the couple who filmed and uploaded my humiliation, will be permanently banned from flying Nova Wings. We are pursuing legal action under digital harassment and defamation statutes. Then she looked around the room, her gaze piercing but calm. We are better than this. But if we want to be better, we must change, from the top down. She took a breath. Which is why, starting this week, we are launching a full-scale company-wide initiative. Every employee, from executives to ground crew, will undergo mandatory anti-racism and cultural sensitivity training. We are calling it the Dignity in Every Cabin campaign. And it will not be a box-checking exercise. It will be a transformation. A few board members stood. One, a seasoned black woman named Denise Holloway, nodded solemnly. Mrs. Morgan, she said, you have our full support. Others followed, voicing their agreement. The atmosphere shifted, from shock to resolve. This campaign will be led by Ava herself, Jordan concluded. Because no one understands what's at stake more than she does. As the meeting came to a close, Ava turned one last time to the staff who had caused her pain. Her voice remained gentle, but firm. I didn't come here today for revenge. I came for change. This isn't about me, it's about every person who's ever been told they didn't belong because of how they looked, how they dressed, or the color of their skin. I want Nova Wings to become the airline where no one feels invisible. Where every seat is earned, respected, and dignified. She stepped away from the podium, her head held high, the boardroom filled with stunned silence and rippling applause. The revolution had begun, not with outrage, but with undeniable truth. And as Ava walked out of that room, Jordan beside her, she knew the storm was no longer behind her. It was in her hands now. And she would use it to clear the skies. For herself. For others. For everyone. 3 months had passed since Ava Morgan stood before the leadership of Nova Wings Airlines and pulled back the curtain on the shameful truths hiding within the very company she helped build. The memory of that morning, her quiet voice, her unshakable presence, the room full of stunned executives and humbled staff, still echoed through the halls of corporate headquarters like a solemn vow etched in stone. What began as a personal humiliation aboard Flight 208 had sparked something far greater than retribution. It had become a movement. The campaign Dignity in Every Cabin rolled out across every division of Nova Wings like a tidal wave of change. It wasn't just mandatory. It was urgent, relentless, and soul-searching. From the baggage handlers in Chicago to the elite corporate managers in New York, every employee went through intensive anti-racism training, cultural empathy workshops, and real-time scenario simulations led by experts from across the country. It wasn't a checkbox. It was a reckoning. And Ava was at the heart of it all, not from behind the scenes, but front and center. She spoke in staff meetings, shared her story in intimate breakroom discussions, and sat quietly at the back of training sessions to listen to the reflections of employees who once saw their passengers as profiles, not people. The change wasn't immediate, but it was real. Inside the company, whispers of respect began to replace the murmurs of judgment. Crew members who once dismissed passengers based on appearance were now pausing, thinking, and learning. For many, it was the first time they truly confronted their own biases. Outside the walls of Nova Wings, the movement had spilled into the national conversation. Ava appeared on morning shows, featured in op-eds, and stood before packed audiences at conferences on corporate ethics and racial equity. She was no longer introduced as just a co-founder or philanthropist. She had become something more profound. A symbol of perseverance. A voice for the voiceless. A reminder that dignity doesn't wear designer labels and justice doesn't ask for permission. But for Ava, none of the recognition mattered unless it translated into lasting change. That's why she insisted on flying again, not as a statement, not for press, but for herself. She needed to see if the revolution she'd ignited had truly taken hold. So, on a brisk autumn morning, Ava Morgan walked through the familiar terminals of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, once again dressed in her quiet elegance. A soft beige dress. Comfortable shoes. Her same weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. This time, the journey wasn't filled with apprehension. It was filled with quiet expectation. As she approached the Nova Wings check-in counter, a young agent with dark curly hair and a warm smile greeted her immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," she said softly. "We're honored to have you flying with us today." There was no condescension. No hesitation. Just grace. The difference was instant, and Ava felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. At the security checkpoint, 2 TSA agents nodded respectfully. "Thank you for everything you're doing," one whispered. At the gate, a flight attendant approached her, not to question her ticket, but to offer her a cup of tea while she waited. These weren't grand gestures. They were simple, sincere acknowledgments. And that made them everything. When boarding was called, Ava stood, stepped into the priority lane, and walked toward the aircraft with a quiet dignity she'd always carried, but that now, finally, was being seen. As she entered the first-class cabin of Flight 377 bound for San Francisco, her eyes met a familiar face. Cole Jensen stood at the door, dressed in full uniform. Gone was the arrogance in his posture. Gone was the dismissiveness in his tone. He stood straight, but humble, his gaze meeting hers with the weight of understanding. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, voice low and respectful. "I just want to say thank you for giving us the chance to do better. And for not giving up on people like me." Ava steadied his face for a moment and then nodded, her voice kind. "Growth is never easy, Mr. Jensen. But it's always worth it." He gave a small, grateful smile and motioned to her seat. "Let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." As Ava settled into seat 2A, the leather soft beneath her hands, she looked around. The cabin buzzed with gentle conversation. Passengers smiled, nodded, and relaxed. There was no tension. No judgment. Just people, traveling together, sharing space, sharing sky. Midway through boarding, Ava noticed something that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something deeply personal. A young black woman in her early 20s stepped into the cabin, nervously adjusting the strap of her canvas tote bag. She wore a plain navy blouse, black jeans, and a quiet expression of uncertainty. Her eyes darted quickly from seat numbers to the faces of the other passengers, as if bracing for the stares, the comments, the same cold judgment Ava had once endured. But instead, a flight attendant, Megan Fry, walked up to her gently. "Welcome to first class," Megan said, with a warmth Ava had never seen in her before. "Let me help you with your bag." The young woman smiled, visibly surprised. "Oh, thank you," she whispered. Megan helped her settle into seat 2C, right beside Ava. Once she was seated, Ava turned slightly and offered a smile. "First time in first class?" she asked. The young woman nodded, laughing nervously. "Yeah. I kept thinking they were going to stop me at the gate or something." Ava smiled wider, her voice like soft rain on warm pavement. "You belong here. Don't let anyone make you question that." The girl's eyes lit up with gratitude. "Thank you. I'm Maya." As the plane ascended above the clouds, Ava looked out the window, the sunlight dancing across the wing. She thought back to the cold air of that first flight, the mocking voices, the camera flashes, the sense of erasure that had once pressed on her chest like a stone. And then she thought of today, the respect, the sincerity, the transformation. Not perfection, but progress. Cole came by again during the drink service, offering a gentle smile as he placed a tray of refreshments before Ava and Maya. Megan followed, offering Ava a quiet, genuine thank you again. Ava nodded, her heart full. It wasn't about an apology anymore. It was about what followed. About rebuilding what was broken. As the plane touched down in San Francisco, passengers clapped lightly, a shared moment of warmth. Ava stepped off the plane into the crisp coastal air, her backpack still on her shoulder, but the weight on her spirit almost completely gone. The revolution she began wasn't just policy or protocol. It was heart. It was humility. It was a mirror held up to a system that too often refused to look at itself. Now, that system was looking. And it was changing. Ava's journey had started with silence, shame, and solitude. But it ended with movement, meaning, and momentum. And from that day forward, every Nova Wings flight carried more than passengers. It carried a promise that dignity had no dress code and respect had no seat class. Ava didn't need revenge. She didn't need fame. What she needed, what she fought for, was to ensure that no one ever felt the way she once did in seat 32D. And now, that future was soaring, just like her, higher than ever before. As the author of Ava Morgan's story, I want to take a moment to speak directly from the heart, not just as a storyteller, but as someone who believes in the quiet power of dignity, resilience, and justice. Ava's journey began with silence. With cruel judgment and humiliation in a space she helped build. She was ridiculed not because of anything she did, but simply because of how she looked, her skin color, her clothes, her simplicity. That pain, unfortunately, is something too many people still endure every single day in different forms. Whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, a courtroom, or on a plane, discrimination doesn't always scream, it often whispers in glances, smirks, or policies designed to exclude. But Ava didn't let her story end in that moment of pain. She didn't retaliate with rage. She responded with courage, truth, and action. She reminded us that real change doesn't always happen with loud declarations, it often starts quietly, with someone who refuses to accept being mistreated. Ava stood up not only for herself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel invisible, unworthy, or out of place. The lesson is this: your worth is not determined by your appearance, your income, or the assumptions of others. True power lies in how you carry yourself when others try to strip away your dignity, and in how you respond. Let your response be one that brings light into dark spaces. Let it challenge systems, not just people. And let it inspire those who come after you to walk a little taller, speak a little louder, and never apologize for existing in spaces where they belong. To every listener and supporter of U.S. Daily Story, thank you for joining us in this powerful narrative. These aren't just stories, they're mirrors. They reflect what's wrong, but more importantly, they show what can be made right. If Ava's story moved you, I invite you to carry her message with you, stand for fairness. Speak against injustice. And never doubt that your voice can be the spark that ignites lasting change. Thank you for listening, for believing, and for being part of a community that chooses justice, compassion, and respect over silence. Until the next story, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget, every person has the right to be seen, heard, and valued.